I'm honored and proud to be this year's recipient of the Cecil B. DeMille Award. I want to thank the Hollywood Foreign Press, all of you. And there's a line that I always wanted to say, top of the world, Ma, top of the world.
Gene Hackman walked off that stage in January 2003 with a Lifetime Achievement Award in his hand. But for 21 years, Hollywood never heard from him again until February 2025, when maintenance workers peered through the windows of his remote mountain compound in New Mexico and found 3 bodies inside, partially mummified. But as disturbing as that discovery was, it was not the most unsettling thing to emerge from that mansion. Because within days, a far darker story surfaced, one about a tunnel and troubling discoveries allegedly sealed inside it. The story that swept across social media in the weeks following the discovery of the bodies was specific. Federal agents had entered Gene Hackman's $4 million Santa Fe estate expecting a routine search and had instead found a hidden passageway behind a library wall, a narrow tunnel descending into an underground chamber filled with wooden crates, cryptic symbols, and human remains. Hundreds of them in some versions of the story. The claims had spread across every major platform within days, and they raised a question that nobody had a clean answer to yet. Was any of it real? And if so, what had been happening inside that compound all those years? To understand where that story came from and whether it held any weight, it was necessary to start from the beginning. From the afternoon, a routine maintenance call in the mountains north of Santa Fe became something else entirely. February 26, 2025. 2 maintenance workers drove up a road that most people would have missed entirely, a narrow cut through dense pinon forest, rising toward a gated community so far from the city that it barely registered on a cell phone signal. They were there for routine work, the kind of job that generates no paperwork anyone reads twice. They noticed the front door was ajar before they reached it. They looked through a window, then another. They did not go inside. They called the caretaker of the subdivision, and the caretaker called 911.
Santa Fe 911, what is your emergency?
Hello, my name is Ron McGee. I'm the caretaker for Santa Fe Summit. I'm here about past 10,000 waves. I think we just found one deceased person inside the house. So I'm going to wait for you at the gate. I'm going to wait for you to please send somebody really quick.
Okay. Are they awake?
I have no idea.
Are they breathing?
I have no idea. I'm not inside the house. It's closed. It's locked. I can't go in. But I see them. She's laying down on a floor from the window.
Okay. Are they moving at all?
No, dude. They're not moving. Just send somebody up here really quick.
Okay, my units are underway, okay?
Deputies arrived at approximately 1:45 in the afternoon. Inside the entrance hall, they found a woman on the bathroom floor. She was dressed in a sweatshirt and sweatpants. An open prescription bottle sat on the counter above her, pills scattered across the tiles. A black space heater lay near her head, angled the way something falls when a body drops beside it. Her hands and feet were mummified. In the mudroom off the kitchen, they found a man. Gray sweatpants, a blue long-sleeve shirt, brown slippers. His sunglasses were on the floor beside him, the way they land when a man goes down without catching himself. A deputy noted that based on their positioning, he appeared to have fallen suddenly. His body showed the advanced decomposition as the woman's. The caretaker who had made that 911 call identified them. The man was Gene Hackman, 95 years old, 2 Academy Awards, 4 Golden Globes, one of the most celebrated actors who had ever lived, found dead on his own floor in the clothes he had been wearing when he fell. The woman, people would come to learn, was a different story entirely. In a latched crate in that same bathroom where she had been found was a German shepherd, Zinna, confirmed dead. 2 other dogs were alive and moving freely through an open door, the only living things left in that compound. The sheriff's office called the circumstances suspicious, not because they believed a crime had been committed, but because 3 bodies in 2 separate rooms of a sealed mountain compound with days of decomposition and no immediate apparent cause of death required a thorough investigation before any conclusion could be drawn. There was no forced entry, no signs of trauma, no gas leak, no carbon monoxide detected. The fire department swept the property. The gas company swept the lines. Nothing. For 10 days, the cause of death remains publicly unknown. Then, on March 7th, New Mexico's chief medical examiner took the unusual step of releasing preliminary findings before the official autopsy report was complete. She stated the circumstances demanded it. The woman had died from hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a rare respiratory disease transmitted through contact with the droppings or saliva of infected rodents. There was no treatment. Once the lungs began to fill, it moved quickly. She had died around February 12th. Gene Hackman's pacemaker recorded his last heartbeat on February 18th, 6 days between them. The full autopsy confirmed Hackman had been in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's disease. His cardiovascular system, already weakened by a triple bypass, an aortic valve replacement, and an irregular heart managed by a pacemaker since 2019, gave out. But what investigators found hardest to process was what the Alzheimer's finding meant alongside the timeline. Hackman had almost certainly been unaware that the woman had died inside that house. He had not called for help. He had not reached anyone on the outside. He had not eaten. The acetone levels in his toxicology suggested prolonged fasting. For approximately 6 days, he had moved through the rooms of a compound so remote it barely held a phone signal, in the advanced stages of a disease that was systematically dismantling his understanding of the world around him, and he had not known he was already alone. Who was the woman found dead in that bathroom? How had she come to be the only person standing between Gene Hackman and the outside world? And what had been happening inside those walls in the months and years before anyone thought to check? Those questions led somewhere far more unsettling than a tunnel. Subscribe to this channel before we go. We cover the stories that don't tie up neatly. Hit subscribe, turn on the bell icon to stay notified. Her name was Betsy Machiko Arakawa. She was born on December 15, 1959 in Honolulu, Hawaii. Her ancestors had migrated from Japan, and she had grown up in the islands with a family that, even after her death, remains almost entirely unknown to the public. Her mother, Yoshi Feaster, was 91 years old at the time of her death, still alive, still present in the world, and yet, across 33 years of marriage to one of the most famous actors in Hollywood, she had never given a single interview, never appeared in a profile piece, never been photographed beside her daughter at a public event. That level of invisibility for the mother of a woman so close to fame was not accidental. Betsy had been a prodigy. She performed with the Honolulu Symphony Orchestra at the age of 11, classical piano, the kind of discipline that requires years of solitary dedication and a willingness to disappear into the work rather than into the spotlight. She later moved to Los Angeles and took a position as a production assistant on the television game show Card Sharks. She was building a quiet life in a city that did not easily make room for people who didn't need to be seen. She was working part-time at a California fitness center in the mid-1980s when Gene Hackman walked in without his membership card. He turned him away. He came back. By the time they began dating in earnest, she had already moved into his Santa Fe home, and the public record on Betsy Arakawa had effectively ended. In 1990, the couple opened the gates of their Santa Fe property once for Architectural Digest. The feature described 12 acres of pinon-covered hilltop north of the city, a house converted from a 1950s block structure into something light and soaring, with a separate studio building, Betsy's grand pianos on one side, Gene's painting studio on the other. Gene told the magazine the location had a kind of magic. That was the last time either of them allowed a camera crew onto the property. They married in December 1991 after 7 years together. Betsy was 31, Gene was 61. The ceremony generated no press coverage, no photographs, no public record of guests or location. The marriage of one of the most decorated actors in American history to a woman who had never given a single interview happened as though it hadn't. In Santa Fe, Betsy had built something that was entirely her own. She and her closest friend, Barbara Lenehan, co-founded a home linens and furnishing store called Pandora's in 2001, sourcing fabrics from across the world, stocking the work of local artisans. She had also helped Gene with his novels during his retirement years, typing his handwritten notes, editing drafts, sitting with the work until it was right. In the acknowledgments of one of those novels, the co-authors thanks her specifically for stepping in to mediate when their disagreements became heated. She was present, capable, and fiercely protective. To the people who knew them in Santa Fe, she was the reason Gene's later years had been so peaceful. Friends described how Betsy managed everything. His diet, in light of his heart condition. She had been known to quietly dilute his wine at dinner parties, mixing in soda water without drawing attention to it. His social calendar, his visitors, his medical care. Gene had no mobile phone. He had no email address. Anyone who wanted to reach him, a friend, a colleague, a journalist, a family member, communicated through Betsy. Their friend Tom Allen told the New York Times that she was very protective. Barbara Lenehan said simply, she was a wonderful wife. What neither of them could explain was the silence that had descended in the months before February 2025. The couple had stopped communicating with family and friends entirely. No calls, no visits, no replies to emails. Neighbors who had maintained regular contact noticed it. Even Barbara, who had known Betsy for 30 years and worked beside her at Pandora's, had last seen her 3 weeks before February 12th. She had not found it alarming. Betsy and Gene had always been that way. February 11th, 2025 was the last day anyone saw Betsy Arakawa move through the world. She ran errands, a Sprouts Farmers Market, a CVS pharmacy, a pet food store. Surveillance cameras captured her at each location. She drove back through the gates of their community at 5:15 that afternoon, using the remote assigned to her account. The gate logs recorded her entry, and then nothing. That same evening, she stopped opening her emails. The following morning, she called a private physician and made an appointment for that afternoon, citing respiratory problems.
Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, the disease that killed Betsy, did not arrive suddenly. It required proximity, extended contact with the droppings, the urine, or the saliva of infected rodents living in or near the home. In an environment as sealed as theirs, a remote compound with no regular outside staff, no frequent visitors, a house essentially closed to the world for years, rodents had moved through the walls long before anyone understood what was happening. The wilderness surrounding that hilltop was not a backdrop, it had crept inside. What Betsy had experienced in her final hours was a rapid and fatal progression. She had recognized something was wrong. The physician's call confirmed that. She had been struggling to breathe, and then she had not made it to the appointment. Her body was found in the bathroom where she had likely collapsed, a space heater lying beside her, pills scattered from an open prescription bottle on the counter above. In her will, Betsy had made a decision that would outlast her by months and generate legal proceedings that were still unresolved well over a year later. She had included a clause: if she and Gene died within 90 days of one another, the entirety of their assets, the property, the fortune, the memorabilia, the rights, would pass not to Gene's children from this first marriage, but to a charitable trust. They had died 6 days apart. The clause activated automatically. Gene's children, Christopher, Elizabeth, and Leslie, had already been excluded from their father's own will, which he had drafted in 2005, naming only Betsy. 3 adult children, estranged for reasons that had never been formally explained, discovering after their father's death that the woman who had managed his world had also ensured, whether intentionally or not, that his fortune would never reach them. The estate was valued at approximately $80 million. His children filed for interested party status in the probate proceedings. The dispute was ongoing. Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa were buried at the Santa Fe Memorial Gardens. A year after their deaths, the grave had no headstone, no flowers, no name. A single conch shell rested against a tree above bare earth. On the first anniversary of their deaths, when journalists visited the site, there were no signs that anyone had come. One of the most celebrated actors in the history of American cinema was buried in an unmarked plot in a city that barely knew he had still been living there by children who were not in his will. The silence that had defined Gene Hackman's last 2 decades followed him into the ground. But something was quite remarkable and hidden in Gene's life, something that some even paint as disturbing. And so, let's go back. January 30th, 1930, San Bernardino, California. Gene Hackman was born into a family that was already coming apart. His father was a physically abusive man who drank and disappeared, and eventually, when Gene was 13 years old, did not come back at all. Not through a confrontation, not through a formal goodbye, through a wave from the window of a moving car as he drove past his son playing in the street. Gene would describe it more than 50 years later on national television with tears in his eyes. I was down the street playing with some guys, and he drove by and kind of waved. He stopped mid-sentence, then laughed thinly to deflect what the room was feeling. It's only been 65 years or so.
I was down the street playing with some guys, and he drove by and kind of waved, and that was it.
But you saw him occasionally, presumably, huh?
Excuse me.
Did life change radically?
It's only been 65 years or so.
That laugh was a door closing on something that had never healed. His mother, Anna, had raised Gene and his younger brother alone after that, in Danville, Illinois, in a house she shared with his grandmother because there was no other option. She drank increasingly as the years passed. The same fragile woman who had once taken a 10-year-old Gene to the movie theater and told him she wanted to see him up on that screen someday, who had planted the idea that made everything else possible, died years later in a fire that started while she slept, a lit cigarette burning down beside her. Gene had already been gone long before that. At 16, he had lied about his age and enlisted in the Marines, not out of conviction, but out of a need to escape a town and a household that had offered him nothing to hold on to. He served 4 years before being discharged in 1951 and drifting back toward the life he had been imagining since those Saturday matinee visits with his mother. At the Pasadena Playhouse, he had enrolled alongside 2 other unknowns, Dustin Hoffman and Robert Duvall. The 3 of them had been voted by their graduating class as least likely to succeed, and an instructor had told Gene directly that he would never amount to anything. He had received the lowest grade the institution had ever awarded. Between the 3 of them, those 3 failures would go on to win 7 Golden Globes. The years before the breakthrough had been corrosive in a different way. He had worked as a shoe salesman, a furniture mover, and a doorman at a Times Square hotel, where a former Marine drill instructor had once walked past him without looking and muttered loud enough to be heard, "Hackman, you're a sorry son of a bitch." Gene had carried that, the same way he carried everything, not by releasing it, but by converting it into something he could use. The French Connection in 1971 had turned him from a character actor into something harder to define. Popeye Doyle had not felt like a performance to the people who watched it. It felt like a man channeling something genuine, brutalizing, relentless, morally compromised in ways that the film asked its audience to sit with uncomfortably. William Friedkin, who directed the film, later said Hackman had been anti-authority from the bone, shaped by a childhood in a region known for its Ku Klux Klan presence, and by a father who had taught him, by leaving, how much a single gesture could destroy. Off-screen, the volatility was just as real. Director Dennis Hopper recalled the eruptions on the set of Hoosiers, a man whose warmth and whose rage occupied the same body without clear warning of which was coming. Liza Minnelli, in a memoir published shortly after Hackman's death, described working with him on the 1975 film Lucky Lady as one of the most professionally painful experiences of her career. She called him downright rude. Nobody who had worked closely with him across those decades was entirely surprised. The family he had built during his rising years had borne the full weight of who he was. He had married Faye Maltese, a bank secretary from a working-class Italian-American family in New York in 1956, when he had been a struggling actor living in a cold-water walk-up apartment whose rent depended on Faye's income. She had believed in him through the cattle calls and the rejections and the years of near nothing. She had raised their 3 children, Christopher, Elizabeth, and Leslie, while he had disappeared for months at a time into film locations across the country and the world. Rumors of affairs during those productions had surfaced across the years, though neither Gene nor Faye ever addressed them publicly. In a 1989 interview with the New York Times, Hackman had spoken about it with an unusual candor. "You become very selfish as an actor. Even though I had a family, I took jobs that would separate us for 3 or 4 months at a time. The temptations in that, the money and the recognition, it was too much for the poor boy in me." He had repeated what his father had done, not with a wave from a car, but with a sustained, chosen absence that stretched across his children's childhoods and across a 30-year marriage that ended in 1986. By the 1990s, he had built a new world on a mountaintop, 12 acres wide, with a gate and a woman who managed every door into it, and no phone, no email, no way to be reached without her permission. His son Christopher had described in rare interviews what it had felt like to have a father who existed primarily on a screen. His daughters had said after the deaths that they had not seen Gene in years, that visits were rare, that communication had passed through Betsy, that the distance was not only geographic, and yet when his will was read, the distance had been formalized into something permanent. The last image the public ever had of Gene Hackman was from March 2024, a frail man leaning on a cane, arm linked with his wife, walking toward a car outside a seafood restaurant in Albuquerque. He was smiling. He looked like a man who had made peace with the size of his world. Within a year, they were both dead inside the walls of the compound they had built together, and the world had not known for 2 weeks. The boy who had built a cardboard room in a basement in Illinois to keep the chaos out had spent his entire life in one form or another building that same room, bigger each time, more reinforced, more remote, until the walls were 12 acres wide and the road that led to them was pitch black at night, and the wilderness had found a way in through the walls. Anyway, which brings us back to the tunnel. In the weeks following the discovery, the story had crossed from social media into the mainstream news cycle. Hundreds of thousands of people had watched it, shared it, and repeated it as fact. The claim that federal agents had entered the property and found a hidden underground chamber beneath Gene Hackman's mansion, filled with crates and symbols and human remains. The story had accumulated details with each retelling, growing darker and more specific with each share. No official statement from the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office, the FBI, or the New Mexico Office of the Medical Investigator ever referenced underground structures, hidden chambers, or any discovery beyond what was documented in the search warrant and the autopsy reports. The story originated from a single entertainment channel that included in its own description a disclaimer stating the content blended facts, rumors, and fiction for entertainment purposes. No credible outlet ever verified it. No evidence of any kind was ever produced to support it. But it spread the way it did because the real story left too many open doors. When people heard the tunnel story and shared it, they were not responding to evidence. They were responding to the unmistakable feeling that something about Gene Hackman's world had never been fully visible, that there were rooms nobody had been allowed into, that the life behind those gates had contained something that the public version of Gene Hackman, the awards, the performances, the lifetime achievement speech, had never shown. They were right. There was no tunnel, that the rooms were real.
George Scott had a line in Patton that I think is appropriate. God help me, I love it. I truly do.
Gene's final words to a Hollywood audience were borrowed from George C. Scott's Patton, the last line of the speech he delivered the night he walked off a stage and never came back. God help me, I love it. I truly do. Whatever had been buried in the walls of that compound, the grief, the guilt, the decades of deliberate distance, the damage absorbed and passed down and never fully named, left with him. If this video gave you something to think about, share it. And if you are not yet subscribed, this channel covers the cases and the lives that the headlines left open. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and we'll see you in the next one.